He walked in with quiet dignity, just an old man in a gray coat. The maitre d' glanced once and told him, "We don't have a table for you." Nobody knew he once helped finance the very block the restaurant stands on. They laughed when he left. They stopped when he returned, owning more than a seat. So who really didn't belong at the table that night? Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. The next morning, the fog still lingered along the streets of Avalon, softening the edges of a city that usually prided itself on polish and precision. Elias Grant stood quietly outside La Belle Maison, the same restaurant that had sent him away just a day earlier. He adjusted the collar of his worn wool coat, the fabric a little threadbare near the seams, and stared at the brass plaque on the door as though it held some forgotten memory. Then, slowly, he walked in. The hostess stand was empty at first. For a brief moment, Elias thought perhaps the morning would be different. But as the double doors to the kitchen swung open, Travis Cole emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth napkin, eyes narrowing the instant they met Elias's. "Back again?" Travis asked, his tone feigning politeness but soaked in irritation. "I have a reservation," Elias replied, calmly, holding out his phone. "Made last night, under the name E.G. Whitman." Travis didn't even glance at the screen. "Must have been a mistake. We don't have anything under that name." Elias turned the screen toward him anyway, an email confirmation glowing in soft light. Travis leaned in. "Read it," then scoffed. "E.G. Whitman," he repeated mockingly. "Sounds made up. Someone must be pulling your leg. Sir, this isn't a soup kitchen. We're not in the habit of hosting social experiments." Laughter came lightly from behind the bar. Miranda, the younger hostess, turned to a coworker and whispered something that ended in a smirk. Lila, the server from yesterday, stood silently near a window table. She didn't look at Elias, but her hands tightened around the edge of her serving tray. "I'll wait," Elias said softly. "There's nothing to wait for." Travis cut in, voice louder this time. "We're full, and you're not on the list." A man in a gray blazer, seated just a few feet away, turned to his wife and muttered, "Why doesn't he just leave? He's ruining the ambiance." Elias caught the comment but didn't flinch. He simply nodded once, folded the email quietly, and slipped the phone back into his coat pocket. Then, with slow and deliberate steps, he turned toward the exit. No one stopped him. No one offered their seat. Not a soul said his name. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Inside, the clatter of silverware resumed. Laughter returned like a tide that had briefly ebbed. To them, the disruption was gone. The day could now continue undisturbed. But Lila stood still, for just a second longer than she should have, her eyes fixed on the door, her tray lowered slightly, and though she said nothing, the question was already rising in her chest, like steam from a dish served too hot. What did they just turn away? Outside, Elias paused on the sidewalk. He didn't look back. He adjusted his scarf, tugged his coat a little tighter, and walked away, not with defeat, but with the quiet calculation of someone who had seen this all before. He'd been turned away before, many times, in different coats, at different doors, but this time, something inside him shifted, not in anger, but in purpose. He didn't know what yet, but he knew this. That wasn't the last time they'd see him. And the door that had refused him, it wouldn't stay shut forever. The room Elias rented was small, tucked above a quiet bakery that opened too early and closed too soon. The floor creaked beneath his steps as he walked in that evening. Letting the door ease shut behind him, he didn't bother turning on the light right away. There was something about dusk, the way it softened every edge, that made his thoughts feel less sharp, less cutting. He sat at the small table near the window, the same one where he drank weak coffee every morning, and reached into the inside pocket of his coat. From there, he pulled out an old photograph. The edges had curled over time, the black and white ink beginning to fade. In the picture, his mother stood outside a diner in Georgia in 1952. Her hands were folded in front of her, her purse clutched tight against her stomach. Behind her, a sign hung crooked in the window. "We reserve the right to refuse service." He remembered the way her shoulders had sagged when they walked away that day. He had only been 9. He hadn't understood then, not really. Only that his mother looked smaller than usual, and that she hadn't spoken the whole way home. That photograph had traveled with him through life, folded between pages of books, tucked into drawers of desks he didn't keep, hidden in Bibles he hadn't opened in years, but never thrown away. He placed it gently on the table, smoothing the corners with his fingers. Then, he opened a notebook, no title on the front, just worn leather and pages yellowed at the edges. He wrote the date, the time, and a simple heading, La Belle Maison, second visit. His handwriting was steady, each word laid down like a stone. He wrote what had been said, who had spoken, how their eyes had moved when they said it, not in anger, but in observation. He had learned, long ago, that truth didn't need to be shouted. It only needed to be written clearly enough that no one could pretend it hadn't been there. The next morning, Elias returned, not with hope, but with purpose. He stood in the foyer of La Belle Maison once more, the scent of rosemary and grilled meat drifting past him. This time, he didn't approach the host stand. He asked quietly to speak with Travis. The manager came out a few minutes later, adjusting his tie with a sharp tug. His eyes narrowed at the sight of Elias. "You again. I don't need a table," Elias said calmly. "I just want to ask a question." Travis didn't answer right away. He crossed his arms and tilted his head. Elias continued, "I'd like to know why I was turned away. I had a reservation. I was quiet. I was clean. What made me unfit to dine here?" Travis exhaled like someone being forced into a conversation he never planned to have. "Look, you made people uncomfortable. You don't exactly fit the look of our usual clientele. Okay? That's just how it is. This place has a certain standard." Elias nodded once, slowly. "So," he said softly, "I made people uncomfortable. By sitting at a table I'd reserved. By waiting for food I was willing to pay for?" "It's not personal," Travis muttered, but the words didn't land with any conviction. "It's about the environment. People come here for a certain kind of experience." Elias said nothing. He just looked at him. Not with anger, not even disappointment, just a quiet, still gaze that held more than Travis could tolerate. After a long silence, Elias turned toward the door. He paused, one hand on the brass handle. "I won't come back," he said quietly, "but I won't forget, and neither will you." He stepped out into the sunlight. The door closed behind him with a soft thud, like a breath held too long finally let go. And somewhere, tucked back in the restaurant near the bar, Lila stopped drying a glass and looked up, just for a moment, toward the exit. She didn't know why, but something about the way he had stood there, so still, so quiet, it made her think of her grandfather, and the things he never talked about. The morning after his quiet confrontation, Elias didn't return to the restaurant. He didn't pace the sidewalk or write in his journal. Instead, he took the train out to the edge of Avalon, where the buildings lost their sheen and everything seemed to slow down. It was a part of the city that had never cared for the polished masks worn in places like La Belle Maison. He stepped into a modest office tucked behind a hardware store, its windows lined with dust and faded flyers for community clinics. The bell over the door let out a reluctant chime. A man with graying hair and a plaid shirt looked up from a desk cluttered with file folders and receipts. "Elias," he said, standing up, "you look tired. I've been carrying a silence for too long. Harold, I think it's time I put it down." Harold Finch had been many things to Elias over the years: accountant, advisor, quiet witness, but above all, he was dependable and discreet. They sat across from each other without needing to fill the space between with pleasantries. Elias handed over a thin folder. Inside was a printout of his email confirmation, the timestamp of his reservation, and a brief note describing what had happened the last 2 days. "I need you to find out everything you can about La Belle Maison," Elias said, "not their menu, their record, employment, complaints, anything you can trace." Harold raised an eyebrow. "You thinking of pressing charges?" Elias shook his head. "Not yet. I just want the truth. On paper." 3 days passed. Elias returned to his routine, walking in the park just before dusk, sitting on the bench near the fountain where no one ever asked questions, and making notes in his journal. He didn't tell anyone what he was waiting for: truth, After all, arrives in quiet clothes. On the fourth day, an envelope arrived under his apartment door. No return address, only his name, handwritten in blue ink. Inside was a note. They've done this before. I thought you should know. L. Beneath the note was a copy of a timecard, Lila's. He assumed. It showed her shift overlapping with an elderly black man's complaint filed months ago, alleging he'd been asked to leave after waiting 40 minutes without service. The notes on the complaint had been marked, resolved, no action. Also inside, a printed receipt with a manual adjustment, a dish added and then voided. Time-stamped within a minute of Elias's deleted reservation. The initials, MC, were at the bottom. Miranda Carter. Elias folded the papers slowly, then looked out the window. Rain had begun tapping against the glass in that soft, persistent way that made the whole world feel smaller. He picked up the phone and called Harold. You were right to ask, Harold said before Elias could even speak. There are 6 complaints in the past year, all dismissed, and I cross-checked the reservation system. There are manual overrides. Someone with access deleted yours 20 minutes before your arrival. Can you prove who did it? I already did. Elias didn't smile. He didn't raise his voice. He just closed his eyes for a moment and nodded. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a glitch. This was a pattern. A quiet one, dressed in politeness and procedure. But a pattern nonetheless. And patterns, once exposed to light, leave marks no apology can erase. Elias Grant stood outside La Belle Maison just past noon. The sun sat high above Avalon, casting thin shadows that slid beneath cafe awnings and across polished sidewalks. He wore a clean navy vest over a crisp white shirt, clothes that fit, but didn't ask to be noticed. In one hand, he carried a leather satchel, worn at the corners but clean, careful. In the other, a folded umbrella he didn't need. The sky was clear. He pushed the door open slowly. No one greeted him. The soft sound of piano music floated from speakers near the bar, blending into the chatter and clinking glasses. People were seated. They were mid-bite, mid-laugh, mid-life. Elias didn't wait to be approached. He walked toward the center of the dining room and stopped beside a table no one was sitting at. A two-top, white linen, a single wine glass already set. Travis appeared from behind the bar, his steps quick and tight. Sir, he said, too loud, his voice already rising with irritation. We've spoken about this. Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Travis at first. He spoke directly to the room. If I had come in wearing a tailored suit, he said, with polished shoes and a silk tie, would I have been seated? The room stilled, not entirely, but just enough to hear the clatter of a spoon being set down too gently. A woman turned her head slightly. A man lowered his menu. If I had walked in speaking softer, Elias continued, using different words, different tone, would I have been welcomed? Travis reached his side. Sir, I'm asking you to leave. You're disturbing our guests. A young man seated near the window lifted his phone, held it up, began to record. Please, Travis said, more tense now. This isn't the place for a scene. Elias turned then, only then, to face him. There is no scene, he said. There's just a question, and no one seems willing to answer it. He unzipped his satchel and began to lay papers out on the table beside him. One by one, no rush, each sheet pressed gently, deliberately, as if setting the table for a meal no one had invited him to share. This, he said, pointing, is a reservation log. Mine was deleted 20 minutes before I arrived. This, he continued, is a copy of 6 complaints, ignored, filed by customers with darker skin than the people seated here today. And this, he added, is your income report. Shows a pattern of table rotation that favors certain demographics. Quiet bias. Dressed as business. People were watching now. One woman stood slightly behind her chair, her hand on the backrest. She wasn't eating. She wasn't blinking. Someone near the bar whispered, is that true? Lila appeared then, emerging from the kitchen door with a towel still over her arm. Her eyes met Elias's. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. I was there, she said quietly. I saw it. No one laughed. The piano music continued playing, but it no longer covered the silence, it merely pointed to it. A silence made up not of noise missing, but truth arriving. Travis stared at the table, at the papers, at the phones being raised, at the waitress beside the man he'd refused service twice. His mouth opened, closed. No words came. From the far end of the room, a woman with white hair leaned over to her husband and whispered, "It's just like before. I thought we were past this." Elias said nothing more. He didn't need to. The chair beside him remained empty, but not invisible. For a moment, it was as if time itself had stopped spinning inside La Belle Maison. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Forks hovered above plates. Every head in the room had turned toward the man in the simple vest. The documents, the empty chair beside him, and the quiet waitress with her hand on his shoulder. Then the front door opened again, and the small chime above it rang like an afterthought. Harold Finch stepped in without ceremony. He was not the kind of man who demanded attention, but in that silence, even his footsteps seemed louder than usual. He carried a flat manila envelope under his arm and walked with the unhurried pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Travis turned at the sound, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. "Can I help you?" he asked, the edge in his voice starting to fray. "You already did," Harold said softly, by ignoring every opportunity to do the right thing. He stopped beside Elias, handed him the envelope, and stepped back without another word. Elias opened it calmly and pulled out a set of crisp, notarized documents. He unfolded the top page and laid it across the table beside the reservation log and complaint copies. "This," he said to the room, "is a finalized purchase agreement for the controlling shares of La Belle Maison." He paused. "As of this morning, I am the majority owner." A small, stunned gasp moved through the room like wind across tall grass. Travis blinked. I didn't know anything about this. No one told me. I had no idea." "You didn't need to know," Elias interrupted, still quiet, still steady. "You just needed to judge. And you did, quickly, without question." Travis opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once, words failed him. From the far corner of the restaurant, a woman stood slowly. She had been seated alone, a light shawl draped over her shoulders, untouched bread on her plate. Her voice was calm but cut through the room like a thread pulled tight. "My mother worked here for 12 years. Until you decided she was too old to fit the image. You told her it wasn't personal. That it was about fresh energy." She took a step closer. "She cried every night for a week. Cried because she thought it was her fault. Cried because she believed you." Travis looked at her, his face suddenly pale. "I don't remember." "She did," the woman said, "until the day she died." Travis's mouth opened again, but nothing came, just the sound of the air conditioner humming uselessly in the ceiling. Elias reached for another page in the stack. He held it up. "Marco," he said, turning toward the kitchen, "could you come out here, please?" The door swung open. Marco, the sous chef with dark circles beneath his eyes and sleeves rolled to the elbows, stepped out. He looked hesitant, but his hands didn't shake. "Last month," Elias continued, "this man approached the board seeking a temporary advance. His daughter needs treatment. He was denied." Marco looked down, then back up, at Elias, at the crowd, at Travis. What the board didn't know, Elias went on, was that he was also willing to put up his savings, his home, and his late father's restaurant shares. No one listened. Elias turned the paper for everyone to see. "I did." The agreement bore both their signatures. Marco's name now appeared alongside Elias's as a minority shareholder. "I gave him the investment," Elias said, "on one condition, that he continued to serve, not just food, but dignity." Marco took a small breath. And for the first time in weeks, it wasn't shallow. Elias looked back at Travis. "You're no longer needed here." Travis didn't speak. His eyes moved around the room, looking for support, for rescue. But the guests who had once ignored Elias now stared back with something else in their eyes. Recognition. Lila stepped forward again and removed her server's apron. She folded it, placed it gently on the counter, and stood beside Elias, not as staff, but as someone who had chosen a side. Travis turned, walked slowly toward the exit, his shoes silent against the polished floor. When he reached the door, he paused, hand resting on the handle. But no one stopped him. No one asked him to explain. For the first time in his life, perhaps, he had nothing left to say. It started with a 37-second clip, grainy, slightly tilted, shot from a phone that trembled just enough to show it was held by someone who knew what they were capturing mattered. Elias, standing by the table, not yelling, just placing a few papers down. A young man in the background whispering, "This is wild," and a voice, calm, older, saying, "He didn't shout, he just asked to be seen." That clip made its way to a college blog, then a local subreddit, then the 7 p.m. evening news. Within 24 hours, #seat for everyone had been tweeted over 100,000 times. People started sharing their own stories. A young woman posted, "They told my dad he needed a reservation, but let the couple behind him walk in without checking. He never wanted to go out again after that." A man wrote, "They made my grandfather wait at the bar for 40 minutes while tables sat empty. He passed last year. I still regret not speaking up." Faces, names, quiet stories that had once ended in shame were now pinned with pride. They were no longer anecdotes, they were patterns. La Belle Maison issued a public statement the next morning. "We deeply regret the experience Mr. Elias Grant endured and acknowledge our responsibility to ensure that our establishment reflects the values of dignity, equity, and respect." Travis was officially terminated. No appeal, no side note of pending investigation. Just a flat, final line. He would no longer be associated with the restaurant. Miranda's personal social media vanished overnight. No more updates about rosé pairings or seasonal decor tips. The following week, she was seen working at a catering company 3 towns over, her smile thinner. Her posts filtered down to silence. And then came the most unexpected turn of all. Marco, the soft-spoken sous chef who had spent months balancing prep shifts and his daughter's medical appointments, was announced as the new executive chef and minority partner. His first act? A community dining program titled Everyone Eats. Every Sunday evening, La Belle Maison would open its doors for a prix-fixe meal that required no payment, only a shared table. Donations were welcomed, but not expected. Guests sat side by side. No name tags, no reservations, only food, stories, and an unspoken vow to be better. The first night, they ran out of soup and made more. And Lila, quiet, steady Lila, was called into the back office a week after everything unfolded. She thought she was being reprimanded for stepping out from behind the service line during Elias's confrontation. Instead, Harold handed her a cream-colored envelope. Inside was a letter. "Congratulations, Ms. Lila Moore. You have been selected as the first recipient of the Elias Grant Fellowship for Community Hospitality Leadership. Full tuition support, housing allowance, and the mentorship of those who believe kindness is not weakness." Lila wept, not because she had earned something, but because someone had seen her trying when no one else had. By the end of that month, the restaurant's regulars began to shift. Fewer suits, more families, elderly couples who hadn't dined out in years, teachers, nurses. One evening, a group of teenage boys came in and sat respectfully, hands folded, asking only, "Is this the place from the video?" Yes, it was. And Elias? He stopped coming by, not out of bitterness, but because he didn't need to anymore. His seat had already been filled, again and again, by those who once believed the door would never open for them. Sometimes, he would pass by on his evening walks, slowing just enough to look through the front window, watching laughter at the tables, watching Marco carry out the special of the night, apron stained but proud, watching Lila guide a nervous new hostess with patience in her tone. He would nod once, then keep walking. The street lamp would cast his shadow long across the sidewalk, but his steps remained light. Because justice, when done right, doesn't roar, it invites. The rain had passed, leaving the sidewalks of Avalon glazed like polished stone. Streetlights blinked on one by one, their glow soft and amber. Inside Maison Grant, the name now etched in cursive gold above the door, a single table near the window was set for one. Elias sat there quietly, hands folded in his lap, a steaming bowl of gumbo placed in front of him. It smelled like memory. No one approached him unless he asked. That was one of the new rules. No assumptions, no projections, no false smiles meant to cover discomfort. It was a place of presence now. A place that asked, not answered. Lila approached softly. Her apron was neat, her posture straighter than before. But her voice held that same gentle steadiness. "Is it what you hoped for?" she asked, setting a fresh glass of water by his elbow. Elias didn't respond at first. He looked around the room, at the young couple sharing dessert near the bar, at the retired teacher grading papers over soup, at the older gentleman in suspenders talking to a table of students like they'd known him all their lives. Then he looked back at her, eyes warm but distant. "I didn't come for hope," he said, "or satisfaction." She tilted her head slightly. "Then what?" He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried years behind it. "To remind them." Lila nodded, not because she understood it all yet, but because something in her heart did. The gumbo sat untouched for a moment longer. Then Elias took a spoonful. Slowly, reverently. The first taste nearly stopped him. Salt, smoke, okra, thyme, and her. His mother's face flickered in his memory, sharp at first, then softened by decades. The scarf tied around her hair. The way she always served herself last. The day she stood outside a restaurant in Georgia, heat pressing down on her back, after the maitre d' refused to let her in. That day, she didn't argue, didn't plead, she just looked down at Elias, then 9 years old, and said, "Not every table is ready for us yet." Tonight, Elias finished his meal in silence. No fanfare, no speeches. When he stood up, the room didn't cheer, but they noticed. A couple at the next table paused mid-sentence. A young server stepped aside, hands folded. A family across the room followed his slow, measured steps with quiet eyes. As he neared the door, a little boy tugged at his father's sleeve and whispered, "Who was that?" The father leaned down, voice low but certain. "The man who made them see again." Elias didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The bell above the door chimed as it closed behind him. Outside, the night air was cooler now, the kind that wakes the skin. He walked slowly, his coat brushing against his calves, his cane tapping soft rhythm against the sidewalk. Behind him, Maison Grant glowed with life. Plates clinked, laughter floated out, stories were told, but none louder than the one left behind by a man who had once been told to leave, quietly, quickly, without fuss. Now, they remembered, and that was enough. "They fed me shame." I returned a seat at the table. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand applause. He simply sat down, where he was once told he didn't belong, and let the truth do the talking. Sometimes, what changes a place isn't anger or noise, but one person who refuses to disappear quietly. How many tables still have empty chairs, because someone was told they weren't welcome? If this story stirred something in you, maybe a memory, a quiet truth, or even a name you haven't said in years, please subscribe to Undercover Truths. We'll be here, walking through more stories that matter. Thank you for listening.